BO4 Ramstein Air Base in West Germany was home to the United States Air Force European headquarters. The base also contained Patriot 1 512th Tactical Fighter Squadron. Tactical Fighter Squadron contained F-4 aircraft that protected the base and protected the surrounding areas from enemy attack. To protect the base from an air attack, the 4th Platoon Bravo Company was deployed in the mountain pass northeast of the airbase. 6 miles southeast of the base was the Air Defense Operations Center, or abbreviated ADOC. The air defense system protecting Ramstein Air Base contained 2 weapon systems: a Vulcan cannon firing 20mm rounds in the air for low flying, and a Chaparral missile system that could knock down anything that was higher. At 22:30 hours on May 23rd of 1974, the ADAC informed the Army Air Defense Unit that an object was tracked on radar flying towards Ramstein Air Base. The object was designated Bogey 1. The Army unit was informed Bogey 1 was flying at 6,000 feet and did not identify itself. The Army unit immediately went into Red Option 1, which meant all air defense systems were activated. After all attempts to identify the bogey failed, the commander authorized the Army unit to shoot down Bogey 1. Both Chaparral and Vulcan systems locked onto Bogey 1. However, at 22:47 hours, just a few minutes later, Bogey 1 disappeared from radar. Now, this bogey left the radar screen and might have landed just north of Ramstein Air Base. So immediately, ADAC notified the Ramstein Air Base command post that this craft left the radar and might have landed. So security forces at Ramstein were notified to search the area for Bogey 1. Now, the security force would have been the Air Force security police personnel, combat trained with heavy weapons and heavy vehicles, going out there and trying to locate where this landed. Now, this is over an hour later. ADAC advised the Army Defense Command that Bogey 1 was flying directly at their location, 16 miles away at 2,900 feet. Now, what happened between that almost 2-hour period of time? We don't know. Now, you can just imagine what the commander of that air defense system thought, how he was going to prepare. I mean, suddenly he's told, here it is, it's coming right at you. Both the Chaparral and the Vulcan system locked onto Bogey 1. The Vulcan fired first at Bogey 1. All the Vulcan rounds struck Bogey 1. Bogey 1 continued to fly, at which time the Chaparral was activated and fired at Bogey, hitting the Bogey. A second Vulcan system fired another 6 rounds. Remember, we're talking about 6,000 rounds of 20mm. Bogey 1 crashed in the field west of Ramstein. It fell in the field some distance away from the air defense artillery personnel, and again, west of Ramstein Air Base, in a large field. The closest community would have been the village of Ramstein, which would have been north of where this craft landed. 1:43 a.m., the German police patrol arrived in the craft. The German police patrol was accompanied by Air Force security. Bogey 1 was on the ground and didn't see any damage. The German fire units arrived on the scene. Now, this presented another problem. These German fire wasn't American fire personnel. Remember, it's German. This is outside Ramstein Air Base. They had no idea what this object was, nor were they ever briefed on what this object was. The object wasn't on fire. The fire was on fire. So somehow, the crash of this UFO ignited the surrounding grassland. Ground assault units of the 32nd arrived on scene. The artillery, the air defense artillery unit, also had an attack force. The area around Bogey 1, the Army Assault Team Commander described Bogey 1 as being elliptical in shape, 20 feet in diameter. There were no windows or doors. Bogey 1 did not contain any emblems or other markings. There was a bluish light emitted from the bottom of the craft. Now, if you were the commander, can you just imagine reporting this back to the
Very disturbing, very disturbing. And what abuses of government in front of the idea that they want to track grasp you where they're going, everything. What could be more repulsive than the government watching my daughter's granddaughter and trying to control their bodies and what they're doing with their lives?
I'm on your side. Watch out, thermite.
And I'm not making that up. That's actually reported on tape of what the commander said. We have a flying saucer. What are we supposed to do? How do we do it? Now, this bluish light is being emitted from under the aircraft.
Semtex out. Swapping back. Tossing sector. Fan-fucking-tastic.
Craft scared a lot of people. Not just that commander of that assault, but also fire personnel. They didn't know if this thing was harmful, emitting radiation. Was there some sort of a ray gun being emitted? They were scared. Fearing the craft could be used as a weapon. Again, did the Soviet Union just send in a nuclear bomb in the form of a flying saucer? Those thoughts were going through a lot of people's minds. From the ground commander on scene, ADAC, the commander of the U.S. Air Force in Europe, and to the commander of SHAPE. SHAPE is in Belgium. It's the controlling mechanism for all He's being briefed on this. What do we do? How do we handle it? Well, once the ground commander notified him that the perimeter around it, they immediately notified the explosive ordnance disposal personnel, or the EOD personnel, the bomb. About 3 hours later, explosive ordnance disposal Army depot, which was adjacent to and arrived. They set up a pit around the UFO. They analyzing equipment to detect radiation, whether this could be a nuclear weapon. Assistance came from the Air Force DOD unit at Capone Barracks. Again, they didn't really know what to do with it. They didn't detect, the EOD personnel didn't detect any radiation being emitted from the craft. Now, this blue light is still appearing at the bottom of the craft. year of authorized Army combat to try to enter. So a assault team made of U.S. Army infantry personnel invaded, and I'm trying to explain that later, specially trained to handle these types of incidents. Now, especially trained Army infantry. Well, it took me a long time to figure that out. We actually had special forces Army special forces. We didn't have Delta until the late 70s, but we had U.S. Army. They were special forces. We had U.S. Army Marines. They were also special forces. But there was a special forces team at a base near Ramstein that sent a special team to the area. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, an assault team, along with EOD and the aircraft, from the bottom hatch. Now, EOD personnel had to blow open something, use explosives. But ironically, it wasn't difficult to open. And what they find, they found 4 non-human bodies. Yes, bodies. EBTs were dead. They searched the interior of the craft, found that there were no other non-human beings, and then they exited the craft. At 9 o'clock in the morning, personnel from the U.S. Army 650th Military Intelligence and Attachment 7024th Office of Special Investigations arrived. The non-human bodies were placed in body bags. The craft was transported on a flatbed to Ramstein Air Base, stored in the hangar. On May 26th, a C-5 U.S. Air Force cargo aircraft flew the craft and the bodies to Nelson Air Force Base in Nevada. The story was featured in several UFO specials in the 1980s. Again, the location was never mentioned. It was just told that the craft was shot down. But again, the location was never mentioned. Now jump ahead to 2010 UFO in Laughlin, Nevada. Robert Dean, Command Sergeant, gave a briefing on it with more detail. But again, the locations were never mentioned. And so jump again to another UFO convention, 2018, which I spoke. In a private meeting, 7 UFO insiders, so to speak, the location was told. And actually FOIA document was received. But again, this FOIA document was heavily redacted. The exact location was So we know this happened. Now, I have to jump back to my time at Area 51. I was in the middle 80s. I was a counterintelligence officer there temporary period. I was replacing another Air Force agent who had been sick. So I came in to replace him doing his duties. I read a document then, which was highly popular, which portrayed. I couldn't talk about it before, but now that it's out, I can talk about it. This craft that was brought to Air in the 70s is still there. But now, in 84, when it was in 1984, they were able to identify this craft. How they did it, I don't know. I wasn't briefed into research and development or technical or scientific data. I was an intelligence officer. I had access to some of the information, but not all of it. The bodies that were recovered from inside this craft that was shot down near Ramstein Air Base, West Germany in 1974, were still there in a cryogenic chamber. I had the opportunity to see pictures of these two bodies, but I was never able to actually go in and learn anything more about it. So this incident really happened. You can do some Googling. There is a full statement on the record, so to speak, on the internet by the lieutenant who was the commander, speaking about this incident, describing in his own words, which is certainly more detailed than my 30-minute presentation can give you. I suggest you go out and read it. It's about an incident that happened at McCord Air Force Base, which is located near Tacoma, Washington. This incident happened in 1972. One of my supervisors, who I worked with at Area 51, was the investigating OS agent for this case. I'm going to talk about a tactical air navigation system, or TACAN. All U.S. Air Force bases maintain a TACAN. On October 14, 1972, two Air Force TACAN technicians drove to the TACAN facility for routine maintenance. The facility was a dirt road, well maintained by the U.S. Air Force road crews. Upon arrival at the TACAN facility, both technicians opened a gate leading into the TACAN. While inside, the technicians heard a strange sound coming from the outside. One of the technicians went outside to determine the noise that they were hearing. He saw a large flying saucer. When I talk about these incidents, I'm using their words, the witnesses' words, not something that is official. The technician reports and later described this incident and described what he saw as a large flying saucer hovering just above the TACAN building. The technician yelled for his partner to come out and look up. The second technician exited the TACAN building, went outside, looked up, and saw the same thing, which he described as a very large flying saucer. Both technicians observed the saucer-shaped craft land directly in front of the building. Now, directly in front of the building is a clearing. Although this is an forested area, there's a large clearing inside the fenced area to the west. One of the technicians went back into the building and called the base police. The phone located in the building. He called the base police to report this incident. Now, you have to stop and think about this. He picks up the phone, he dials a certain number, they didn't have 911 back then, on the base, 555 got you an emergency dispatch. The emergency dispatch contained the base police, fire dispatch. He told the dispatcher, who answered the phone, that a flying saucer had landed where he was located, and that they needed some help. He also observed two entities wearing silver suits, bright gold-colored helmets, exit the craft. Now, he's inside the building with the phone, describing what he's seeing on the outside. He's giving real-time information to the dispatcher at the base police office. Now, obviously, this technician on the phone and the other technician that was standing near the phone were startled by what they were seeing. They were seeing a UFO land flying saucers, and two entities, as they call them, exit the craft. And they walk towards the technicians.
I'm reloading.
As the one technician was describing in real time what was happening, he startled. He said, "I'm startled. Hold on a minute." And then he came back a few seconds later and said, "They're walking into the building." Now, these two technicians are close together at the entrance to this building, and there's a regular door leading from the outside into the back-end building.
On your six.
These two entities walk past the technicians into the building. Now, the strange part about this is that the technicians, although one of them was on the phone and the other one was standing in close proximity to his partner, they feared
Friendly care package on the way.
that they would be harmed if they moved. So they never moved. But somehow, these two entities got through them. They walked through them. They got through them some way. That's how
System
he
online.
described it.
Taking fire.
They walked by us. There wasn't enough room for anybody to walk past them. It's a regular door. And both technicians were in the doorway. How did these two entities get by them? That puzzled a lot of people. We're going to talk a little bit about the explanation later. The entities walked into the building. One of the technicians turned around and watched them. Now the building was about 12 foot by 16 foot. It wasn't a big building. And it also contained racks of electronic equipment. Plus, the radio equipment was also in there. The radio repeater system was also in the building. So there wasn't a lot of area to move around. The only thing other than that in this building was a small desk with a chair that the technicians could record in the log. One chair. One of the technicians watched these two entities move around the building, looking at the equipment. Just kind of walking by reviewing. And then the two entities exited the building and walked to the rear of the TACAN building. They came out and walked around to the back of the building. The two technicians moved into the building and locked the door from the inside. They realized their safest place was inside the building. They could lock it from the inside, and they had a telephone, and they had limited supplies to survive. They didn't know how long they would be in there, but they figured they were safe inside the building. It took about 17 minutes for the U.S. Air Force Security Police to arrive on scene. Now there's another complication. The two U.S. Air Force Security Police personnel, armed, exited a patrol vehicle and confronted the saucer. It was parked right there. Although the two SPs did not have any contact with the technicians, the technicians were locked inside the building. They did examine the saucer. Again, the two entities weren't around. The two police couldn't see anything. They just saw this ramp that's down on the ground, the saucer sitting on some tripods. So the security police personnel thought they would examine the craft to see maybe these entities were inside. Interviewing them later, one of the senior security police persons thought that this might have been some sort of an Air Force craft that was secret. A short time later, the two technicians exited the building and informed the SPs of what happened. And they pointed to the rear of the building, saying, the enemies are back here, behind the building. At this time, a second U.S. Air Force security patrol arrived. This time, there was a security policeman with his working dog, or a patrol dog. The patrol dog immediately ran to the rear of the building, ran away from his handler to the rear of the building, and began to bark. The dog handler ran behind the building after his dog. The patrol dog confronted the two enemies. They were standing behind this building. Verbal commands were given by the security police, but the commands were not obeyed. It appeared that these two entities couldn't understand anything in English, and they didn't respond in any other language. They were in front of the security policeman, a dog handler with his dog, but they didn't understand what the security policeman's commands were. The entities continued to move towards the saucer. The patrol dog then attacked one of the entities, tearing the sleeve of the entity's uniform or outfit. Unbeknownst to the SPs, another entity exited the craft. Now, no one knew that there was another entity inside the craft. The two SPs that initially responded to the scene did walk up the ramp and look in, but thought maybe this was some kind of experimental Air Force craft and decided not to go any farther. As the entity was attacked, he pointed something at the dog, which caused the dog to immediately run away. Not harming the dog, not shooting the dog with any kind of explosive device or bullet, but it scared the dog. Both entities carried the injured entity back to the craft. So the one that got out of the craft came back to where the other two were. The attack on the one entity seemed to injure him, and he was on the ground. But the other two entities picked him up and carried him back to the craft. One of the SPs pulled out his .38 caliber revolver and fired several rounds at the entities. I don't know if that was such a good idea, but placing yourself in such a situation that you had virtually unknown entities attacking you, or being in your presence, maybe, they considered it a hostile act because they chased the dog away. And they didn't know what this device was that one of the entities was carrying. So the one policeman fired his gun at the one entity. The bullet seemed to stun one of the entities, who then fell to the ground. Now we have two injured entities. Additional SPs and two U.S. Army military policemen from nearby Fort Lewis arrived on scene. They just happened to be in a patrol area, and they heard the call for assistance, and they arrived. Eventually, the entities were able to pull their injured comrades back into the craft. But the craft did not immediately fly away. It remained on the ground. It was surmised that the entities were trying to maybe provide first aid to their injured comrades. A U.S. Air Force security police supervisor arrived on scene and ordered the guards to disable the craft in some way. Now, no one knew where this craft came from. No one knew exactly what this craft was made of. Two entities that appeared non-human. So how were they going to disable this craft? They tried a number of things by shooting an M16 rifle into the bottom portion of the craft. Now remember, the bottom portion of the craft was still open. They even tried to fire rounds into that area. Eventually, a beam of light was directed out of the side of the craft, striking one of the Army MPs. He fell to the ground. The other MPs, security policemen, quickly moved away from the craft. Now we got an injured soldier. They pulled him away. When they pulled him away. The others retreated some distance, safe distance away. The craft then flew away towards the west. 2 F-106 fighter jets from the 318th Fighter Interceptor Squadron on base flew to intercept towards the craft flying west. However, this UFO, or flying saucer, was able to outfly the 2 F-106 jets. Eventually, the AFOSI arrived and began a detailed investigation of the incident. The incident was classified top secret and remained in OSI files unsolved. Eventually, this incident was moved into a training manual for OSI agents. Now, when the OSI agents arrived on scene, what did they do? They immediately started an investigation. They started to collect evidence. The injured military policeman was transported by ambulance to Madigan Army Hospital, which was just a short distance away. He was examined and found burns on his left arm and left side, near the lower part of his ribcage. Doctors examined these wounds, but couldn't determine how they were formed. What happened? Ray gun, or as they mentioned, the doctors mentioned the whole side, or what kind of maybe laser was pointed at this particular MP to disable him. Speaking with this MP later, he said he was disabled, so his whole body felt numb and he fell to the ground. He couldn't move. But it was only short-lived. He said after a few minutes he was able to get back up again. But then he noticed that his uniform was showing. And then he noticed that his skin was showing, both on his left arm and just under his ribcage. The military work done was also examined by veterinarians, military veterinarians, who found the same style burn marks on the dog in 2 different places. What caused that? We never found out. What happened to this craft after it left? It flew west, flew up towards Olympia National Forest in northwestern Washington. The F-106s pursued it. Now, these 106s had a pelting round that they could fire to disable this flying saucer. But the flying saucer outflew the F-106s. At the time, in 1972, these F-106s were advanced fighter jets. We didn't have F-16s, F-15s back in those days. These were probably one of the most advanced fighter jets, fighter interceptor jets that the Air Force had. They were on alert 24 hours a day, 365 days a year at McCourt. And 2 of them always called Genies. So these jets were fast, but they could never catch up. Some reports say that the flying saucer landed in the ocean off Vancouver Island. This was reported to us. This was contained in the OSI report. And some reports claim they gained altitude and flew outside. What was this flying saucer? Where did it come from? I mean, why was it interested in the TACAN facility, the Tactical Air Navigation System, or the radio receiver system for the base? Was it something that had been seen before, or maybe they had encountered the TACAN signals and wanted to know where they were originating from? Some of the scientists surmised that happened, that this signal that the TACAN was sending out, they were homing in, and they wanted to know where this came from. Why they landed when they did, in plain sight of Air Force personnel, we just deployed them. But it was a strange incident that happened. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but it's maintained in the annals of UFO history, maintained by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. On January 22nd, 1985, U.S. intelligence learned of an incident involving the Soviet military and a UFO near an intercontinental ballistic missile site, or abbreviated ICBM site, near the town of Chermenchova, in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. U.S. intelligence had a deep cover asset, or agent, working for the Soviet military in the area. Now, an asset is somebody that we send in to do the work for us, or we call them within the intelligence community the agents. The agent isn't the case officer that sends them in. The agent is somebody, probably normally a citizen of that particular country, who's doing the work undercover. According to this agent, a UFO landed near an ICBM site, number 62, in the early morning hours of January 12, 1985. Now, notice those two dates. January 22nd is when we learned about it, but the incident happened January 12th, a 10-day span. Well, it takes some time for agents operating deep inside a country to report back to their case officer. And this is a case of that. This agent reported a confrontation occurring between Soviet military units and the UFO occupants. The Soviet soldiers shot one of the occupants of the UFO after the occupant approached the soldiers. After the shooting, several other occupants of the craft retrieved the injured occupant and returned to the craft. A beam of light directed against the Soviet military jeep destroyed the jeep, completely vaporizing the vehicle. The Soviet commander in the area ordered his troops to destroy the UFO. Several rounds of a 12.7 millimeter gun was directed at the craft. Now here we have a war or a battle occurring on Earth inside a communist country between a military force, earthbound military force, and an alien force. Now you can just imagine what information was being relayed from the scene through systems, through teletype systems or military communication systems, all the way to the Kremlin in Moscow. You know, fortunately, we were able to tap into some of those communications. We had the National Security Agency with spy satellites flying around the Soviet Union, especially in this area. And those satellites didn't just pick up what was on the ground as a photographic intelligence. They were also picking up signal, or SIGINT as we call it, signal intelligence, or ELINT, electronic intelligence. One of the 12.7 millimeter rounds struck the bottom of the craft. The craft glowed a bluish green color. At the time, 4 occupants of the craft exited and were taken in custody by Soviet military troops. The occupants were described as 1 meter in height, weight about 25 kilograms, no hair, 4 fingers, no thumbs, narrow feet, wearing heavy boots. The occupants were wearing tight-fitting silvery suits. No weapons were observed on the occupants, which the Soviet military named Shoshashka, or creatures in English. That's the word for creatures in English in Russian. Now, I've done enough of these presentations, and I'm sure my viewers out there have listened to the description of ETs in the past. This particular description of ET sounds just like the Greys, exactly like the Greys, with exception of the boots. But this might be just the interpretation of what these ETs are wearing by the Soviet military. The creatures were transported to Sasha-Lakova, a military barracks near this location, and detained. Once at the barracks, the Soviet doctors examined the creatures, including the injured one. The doctors revealed the creatures' eyes very oversized compared to the size of their head. The head was pear-shaped, no ears were observed on the creatures. The mouth consisted of just a small slit. 2 small openings were above the mouth and was assumed to be the nostrils. An attempt was made by Soviet intelligence personnel to communicate with the creatures. A number of different languages were used to try to communicate with them: Russian, English, French, German, and even Chinese. However, the creatures could not understand any of these languages. Sign language and other attempts to communicate failed. The occupants sat without making a sound. Now, you can imagine what these creatures were feeling. Maybe we can't because we don't know how they think. But we as humans would be pretty scared. We're in a hostile environment. They're being interrogated by strange-looking creatures themselves. We, humans, who were wearing guns or weapons. The creature's craft was secured by Soviet military personnel. The craft was described as being 15.5 meters in diameter, 5 meters high. The craft was dark gray colored with no noticeable engines. And it did not have any markings at all. No markings whatsoever on the craft. It did have lights that would come on and off at various locations on the craft, but there wasn't any other markings. U.S. intelligence analyzed the report given by this agent. The agent was a reliable source U.S. intelligence had used for 22 years. So this spy, as I can call him, had been working for United States intelligence for 22 years. So he was a reliable asset to us. We knew the agent was there. He was part of the Soviet military team. Although he wasn't actually at the scene, he was in a supervisory position, and he was located some distance away from this. But he was receiving all the communications that was occurring between the ground forces and the command post. The information provided by the agent is somewhat unbelievable based on the subject matter. However, U.S. intelligence feels the information warrants further investigation. Now remember, I talked about collecting ELINT, SIGINT, and voice intercepts before. That information wasn't available to the agents, our assets on the ground at the time, or our team of case officers. That information came later. Ironically, U.S. intelligence did obtain 22 of the 100 photographs taken at the scene. Now, we also were able to direct additional assets into this operation. Not necessarily assets to the scene, but assets within the Soviet Union to verify some of the information through other sources. In 2006, Mikhail Mugrovich came forward to relate additional information on the incident. He was a KGB agent that investigated this incident at the scene. Now, years later, we have a KGB agent coming forth and saying, I was there, all I can tell you about. So Mikhail told us what happened. According to Mikhail, he was on duty in the area of this event. And this is his story. On the early morning hours of 11 January 1985, a UFO landed at Zermorlov, a small village west of Chermachova, the Soviet police from Kayutka was dispatched to the scene. The UFO was on the ground for 1 hour. The UFO took off after the police arrived. The UFO flew southwest to the missile site where the confrontation occurred. Now we see that a day before the original incident happened at Chermachova, this particular, we think, and they think, KGB thinks it's the same craft, landed some distance away from Chermachova in a small village, Soviet village. The two creatures, including the injured one, were taken to a military base at not Sashalakova. So now there's some different information that we're receiving from the former KGB agent, differing of what information was given to our asset, or information that our asset gave to us. That's common. There's so much occurring in a particular area at the time. If you have two assets working independently of each other, they may give you different information. The creatures did communicate with one of the young Soviet soldiers through hand signals. The creatures escaped from the barracks where they were being detained, even though they were being guarded by the elite KGB border troops. Now, within the Soviet Union back in those days, the KGB controlled the border, and they had elite troops, which would be similar to our Rangers or Delta Force Commando, or even similar to the GSG-9 West Germany border patrol. The creatures escaped. Now remember this, they were guarded, they were in a secure facility, and somehow they disappeared. If you put all this together, you realize that a real incident happened inside the Soviet Union. Maybe this was the Roswell. Actually, this would have been more than just a Roswell incident. This is an actual battle that occurred on the ground inside the Soviet Union between the Soviet military and extraterrestrials. What happened to these extraterrestrials? How did they escape? Or did they just disappear? Did they have the ability to do that? And why hadn't they disappeared prior to this? All these questions we can think about, theorize, we don't know the answer to. They're gone. But what the Soviets did have, and now the Russians have, is the craft. The craft didn't disappear. The craft is still in hands of the Russian government, probably at Kapustin Yar or some other place being analyzed. And maybe even the reverse. I mean, we do this, we did this. I'm sure and this is probably not the only they have another craft. It sounds to me like this craft is a lot bigger than the other two crafts they had. So now they have at least 3 crafts. Anyway, that concludes my presentation regarding the incident at Chermachova. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, I'm Richard Doty. From 1951 to 1978, the United States Air Force operated a series of radar sites throughout the United States, Canada, and Alaska. Benton Air Force Station was one of these defense zone radar sites, located on top of Red Rock Mountain in central Pennsylvania. On March 5th, 1965, 2 Air Force technicians assigned to the 648th Radar Squadron was assigned to repair the radar antenna located near the northeast corner of the radar site. At Red Rock, at the Air Force Station at Benton, there was a height finder radar system, which meant it found high-flying objects. They both drove to the antenna. The day was blustery. with high winds and frequent blowing snow. The technicians arrived at the radar antenna and opened the outer door to access the control system for the radar. Just as both technicians were about to enter the building, they observed an object hovering directly above the antenna. It was a disc-shaped object that was just a few hundred feet above their location. In the front of the site, or east of where they were at, west of where they were at, was a softball field. And just adjacent to the softball field was a helicopter port. The sergeant walked inside the radar building and telephoned radar command post. Sergeant reported the incident, but the command post was unaware of any object on radar. Now remember, this is a radar site. So any objects flying near this site would be detected on the site's radar system. But the operator at the command post told these two technicians, we don't have anything on the radar screen. They became concerned about that. When the sergeant exited the building, he couldn't find the airman. Couldn't find his partner. Looked around, couldn't find him. The sergeant observed a disc-shaped object on the ground, just adjacent to the radar building. As the sergeant looked around for the airman, he noticed that the airman was standing next to the craft that was on the ground. The sergeant yelled for the airman to get away from the craft, and the airman returned to hit the sergeant's location. Both technicians were amazed at what they were seeing. This huge disc-shaped object had landed inside a U.S. Air Force radar site in Pennsylvania. There were lights around the middle portion of this flying saucer, as they later called it. Both technicians walked to their maintenance vehicle so they could drive away. They decided discretion is a better part of valor, so to speak. They didn't want to confront it. They didn't know what it was. And decided to just get away from it. But as they were approaching the vehicle, they were frozen. Neither man could move. Then the two men saw two strange creatures exit the craft. The two creatures were wearing thick silvery suits, similar to flight suits. The creatures wore helmets with strange tubes on each side. Both men then felt extremely dizzy. The command post sent an air policeman. Back in those days, military policemen within the Air Force was called air policemen. When the air policeman arrived, he couldn't find either technician. Another air policeman arrived and completed the search of the area. They found the truck, they found the tools, but they couldn't find either the sergeant or the airman. Command post. The command post then notified the Pennsylvania State Police of the missing technicians. Then they conducted a search, both inside the radar site by air policemen and by other site personnel, because this site only had a military policeman assigned to the site. The search lasted 16 hours. Sometime later, a state trooper patrolling the state route 487 found the two technicians walking south along the road, 5 miles from the main gate of the radar site. The two radar technicians were taken back to the radar site. The two technicians were treated by Air Force medics at the radar site, but then transported to a hospital at the town of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, for advanced treatment. When they got to the hospital in Williamsport, the doctors detected some strange material on their uniforms. They're still wearing their Air Force uniforms, their fatigue jacket, their pants, shirt, and boots. They couldn't detect what that was, but they were afraid that it might be radiation. So they took their outer clothing off, took all their clothing off, placed it in boxes for the Air Force personnel to analyze later. The command post at Benton immediately notified higher authorities. Notified their command post at Stewart Air Force Base, and also notified the Operations Defense Air Sector at Griffiths Air Force Base near Rome, New York. Air Force Office of Special Investigations sent a team of agents to the radar site. OSI agents interviewed two technicians at Williamsport Hospital. The two men told their story to the agents. They did this 2 different times, separated from each other. Meaning one technician was in one hospital room, the other was in the other hospital. They told their stories to 2 different agents. The stories were exactly the same, but they lost time. They were unconscious. They couldn't tell everything that happened, everything right up to they got close to the craft, the dizziness started, then they found themselves walking along a highway north of the site. They didn't know what happened. Examination of the two Air Force technicians revealed strange marks on their necks, face, legs, and back. Both men were dehydrated. Both men were eventually airlifted to an Air Force hospital at Stewart Air Force Base in New York for advanced care. Air Force OSI agents went to the Benton Air Force Station, went to the site where this allegedly happened, examined the area, and found 4 pod marks, or 4 marks in the ground, indentations. But in the Air Force OSI report, they identified them as pod marks, as if pods, landing pods, had been indented into the soil. Now remember, there was snow on the ground during that time period. The OSI agents arrived about 12 hours later, but there were still indentations in the snow. They analyzed those indentations, and there was some small amount, there was some radiation detected. Nothing else was found in the scene, nothing inside the building. The tools were analyzed, the tools weren't radioactive, and nothing was wrong with the radar. One of the concerns was maybe somebody came in, a foreign power, an enemy, a hostile force, landed and disabled the radars. But the radars were not disabled. They were operating just fine, functioning normal. So that didn't happen. The men were tested for drugs and alcohol, and none were found in the system. The radiation test showed above normal levels of air. The uniforms worn by the technicians, which were taken off at the hospital, contained trace amounts of alpha and different types of radiation, alpha being particles, beta being particles, gamma being rays, and then there's X-rays. Alpha is the least deadly because the skin can stop the penetration into the human body. The only way to get into to harm a human is through inhalation or injection. But they didn't find any alpha radiation in the technician. Through further questioning, they revealed that once the 2 technicians were frozen, the 2 creatures moved them into a disc-shaped object. Once in the craft, both technicians were placed on examination. At this point, the 2 technicians were able to see the creatures without helmet. These creatures were gray in color, large eyes, no ears, only small openings for mouth. Although the creatures did not speak English, it seemed the 2 technicians were able to hear voices in their head. Now, let's talk about that a minute. We've heard this before in the past, this is 1965, in past the previous abduction cases, and then abduction cases that happened. That although the ETs couldn't speak English, the abductees were able to understand them through some voices in their head. Now later on, years later, the scientists realized that it wasn't telepathy that it was occurring, it was thought transfer. Whatever the person was thinking was being transmitted through thought pattern or some way into the other mind. Both technicians lost walking along a road where they were picked up by a state trooper. Both technicians were transferred to the Air Force Psychiatric Center at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas. The Air Force had a psychiatric center where they analyzed and housed airmen, military personnel who had gone through some kind of psychological episode or had some kind of psychological problem. During a session with an Air Force psychiatrist, the doctor asked the two technicians if they had been abducted by space creatures. Both technicians answered yes. This was the first time the subject of UFOs, extraterrestrials, were mentioned both by any kind of military personnel or by the Both technicians were eventually released back to duty and was discharged from active duty after their term of enlistment had expired. This is how we learned about it. Chief Master Sergeant Chet Walters convention in 1992. Chief Master Sergeant Walters was one of the duty sergeants on duty at Benton Air Force Station on March 5th, 1965. Chief Master Sergeant coordinated the on-base search for the two technicians. So now we have somebody who actually was there, although he didn't witness the abduction, he was involved in the search for these two airmen who went missing inside the United States Air Force radar site in Pennsylvania. I had the opportunity to look at the OSI report. I read the entire report. Again, I had some redactions. The redactions, we could piece together what was mentioned in the redactions. Most of the redactions pertain to the mission of the site, some classified information regarding how the radar worked, how the height finder worked, what range the height finder had, what range the long-range radar had. But it didn't have anything to do with ETs, just classified information regarding the site. The Air Force OSI report also contained details, specific details on forensic examination of the soil. Although the initial report that was made in 1965 didn't contain a full examination of the soil and the snow around where this incident happened, or full examination of the pod marks. This subsequent OSI report, which was dated in 1966, June of 1966, some 15 months after the incident, contained a detailed examination and analysis of the soil, the snow, and there was microscopic evidence of some unknown material on the ground and in the snow. When the snow was taken, it was placed by the forensics people from OSI, it was placed in cold containers. They wanted to maintain the snow at its original form. When they melted the snow and filtered it, they found this trace material that they couldn't understand what it was. They had it analyzed by the top metallurgists in the nation. It was sent to Los Alamos National Laboratories, Sandia National Laboratories, and even Lawrence Livermore. They couldn't determine what this material was. Trace, as I said, trace amounts of something. Well, even today, they can't determine what.
With high inflation, working families like mine are hurting. And while we struggle, Kamala Harris supported spending our tax dollars to give illegals sex changes. It's not just liberal, it's insane. Kamala can never be our president.
That material was. It's unknown to this planet. The molecular structures and other analysis couldn't determine whether it was something within our atmosphere or something that we have on our planet Earth. It wasn't. They couldn't identify anything within the periodic chart, which contains all our elements. So they never found out what it was. They've done since some tests, as I was told, and this material might just be something that was a isotope of hydrogen. We know of 3 hydrogen isotopes: hydrogen, deuterium, and tritium. Tritium is radioactive. There's also could be a 5th. The 4th one is short active. They could develop it, but it goes away real quick. Pentagon, as we know now today, they found this isotope within hydrogen. It's probably what was found there at Benton, but they still haven't fully identified it. These 2 technicians are alive today. We eventually, at one UFO convention, invited both of them. One of them came, the other one didn't because of a sickness. But he refused to talk about what he went through. It was traumatic to him. He was afraid to discuss the issue. That particular airman, he was the airman, got out of the Air Force and then went back into the Air Force and made a career out of the Air Force, retiring as a senior sergeant within the Air Force. But he did tell us privately this story, and it was very shocking to him. That concludes my presentation on the incident at Red Rock. In 1959, a UFO landed at a remote, distant early warning radar site in northern Yukon Territory, Canada. The site was manned by U.S. Air Force and Canadian Forces technicians. The site was called BAR 2 and located at Shingle Point on the Arctic Ocean near McKenzie Bay. Now this is way up in Canada. During the early morning hours, a radar technician observed an object flying from the northwest. The technician tracked the object on radar. The object was traveling faster than a normal aircraft. Remember, this is 1959. Thinking the object might be an asteroid, the technician switched on a different radar screen, which confirmed the object was a controlled aircraft changing directions. The technician notified a supervisor, a U.S. Air Force captain. The captain contacted other radar sites along the dew line. Other radar sites confirmed the object was an aircraft. The captain notified the North American Air Defense Command at Ent Air Force Base, which was the newly formed command. NORAD was newly formed back in those days. 2 F-102 fighter planes were dispatched from Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. You gotta understand that this is a remote location. There wasn't any other Air Force bases around there. So several hundred miles away in Alaska was the closest air defense base available to launch aircrafts. The object being tracked eventually landed just north of the radar site. Although the site was manned by military police, there were no fully armed troops within 500 miles of the radar site. The commander of the site, a U.S. Air Force major, was initially told that the object could be a Soviet transport plane. Now, this is 1959. The Cold War had already started. We knew the Soviet Union was the enemy. Now we see something coming in on a radar screen that was changing directions and landed. And now this commander of the site is told this could be a Soviet transport plane. What would a Soviet transport plane be doing landing in a remote area up near McKenzie Bay in Yukon Territory? An invasion. There's certainly a lot of scenarios that he thought about. The commander of the site sounded an alert and issued weapons to all 49 site personnel. The military police assigned to the site left and drove to investigate the object. The military policemen were armed with M2 carbines and .38 caliber revolvers. Upon arrival at the object's landing location, the MPs observed a saucer-shaped craft on the ground, and 2 humanoid creatures were outside the craft. They quickly notified through radio the command post. telling them that, hey, we don't have a Soviet transport plane here. That's the good news. The bad news, so to speak, is we got a flying saucer on the ground with two humanoid-looking creatures on the outside of it. Now, I'm joking somewhat, but that's basically what they had. The creatures were described as 4 foot tall, thin-built, wearing tight-fitting jumpsuits, silver in color. Both creatures wore dark or gray helmets. The creatures didn't seem interested in the MPs. One of the creatures was carrying a long cylinder device. Fearing the device might be a weapon, the MPs retreated to their vehicle and notified the site by two-way radio. However, the radio didn't work. Shortly afterwards, 2 F-102 fighter jets arrived in the area. These 2 jets were launched from Elmendorf Air Force Base to intercept this craft in the air, but of course now it's on the ground. The 2 creatures got back inside the saucer-shaped craft and it flew away. Since the 102s were launched from Elmendorf Air Force Base, hundreds of miles away, they had limited fuel, limited flight range. And since the 102s couldn't catch up to the UFO, they had to break away and return to base for refueling. Aircrafts from Canadian Forces Base Camos on Vancouver Island were launched to intercept the object. The radar site at Punsel, British Columbia, started tracking the UFO, but the object was eventually lost on radar. The newly formed NORAD investigated this incident in June of 1959. Writing a report and submitting it to Headquarters Air Force, the radar tapes and photographic evidence was submitted. Project Blue Book investigators flew to Bar 2 and conducted an investigation. This case was on one of the 55 in Project Blue Book files that was classified as top secret. So we had Blue Book back in those days. It originated in '52. Before that was Project Sign and Grudge. So we had UFO investigators, Blue Book investigators, that wanted to investigate this site and this incident to determine what actually happened. And so all the information pertaining to this particular site incident at Bar 2 was classified top secret. The official report released stated the object was a Soviet transport plane that got lost in bad weather. The only problem was that there was only one airport in the area, and that airport, Barter Island Airport, 10 miles away, was closed during this time. The U.S. Air Force had not released a full report, only a heavily redacted document. So what actually happened at Bar 2? The Air Force gave out a story that, the site was, didn't really identify what happened. The military policeman misidentified the flying saucer as a Soviet transport plane. Back in those days, the Soviets didn't have many advanced cargo planes that could fly great distances. And some smart people figured out, in order for that Soviet transport plane to fly from the closest base inside the Soviet Union over the Arctic Circle and land at the base or near the site, they would have to have flown 2,700 miles without refueling. There wasn't any aircraft in the Soviet arsenal that could do that. This is a document, the history of the DEW line, or the Distance Early Warning Radar sites, from 1946 until 1964. Lo and behold, in this document contained some information about this incident at Bar 2. But again, as you can see, it's redacted. The classification is redacted. The date is there, June of 1964, but everything else is redacted. I'm not going to show you the other pages because guess what? They're all redacted. Pertaining to Bar 2. Okay, let's talk about what really happened at Bar 2. There was a person assigned to Bar 2, a Canadian Forces sergeant, that is still alive. Still alive today. He was 18 years old when he was assigned to Bar 2. And he's in his 90s now. But he talks about what happened at Bar 2. And we're going to relate to you what he told us. It was a heavily fogged day when this craft landed. It created a lot of stir among site personnel. Remember, there were 49 personnel, military personnel, Canadian and U.S. Air Force, assigned to the site. He said, we saw what it was. We saw on radar, the radar signature showed that this was not an airplane. This was a round disc-shaped object that came in to the radar range area. They identified it as something non-identifiable, bogey, so to speak, and wasn't an Air Force or any kind of conventional aircraft that they could detect on a radar screen. And the radar, even back in those days, knew what a conventional aircraft looked like and knew what the signature or what was appearing on the radar screen was. And this was not a conventional aircraft. It was a flying saucer. It landed. He was in the operations center when the two military policemen returned and spoke with the commander and were scared to death. They said that these creatures were not human. They were animals. And they had this cylinder object they thought was a weapon. And now this is where it gets really interesting. Because one of the military policemen fired his weapon. He fired his handgun, not his rifle, but his handgun, which was a .38 caliber revolver. He fired this weapon at the creature, carrying the cylinder. So now we have a discharge of a firearm at this creature. But the creature didn't seem to be harmed in any way. In fact, the senior military policeman said it seemed to him like the bullet went right through that creature. Now, if we were to read everything in this document, go through this entire document, it's going to explain everything that happened at Bar 2 near McKenzie Bay in 1959. But we're not able to do that. The Air Force is still keeping this from us. Now, we're talking about disclosure. Let's open up files, all the different incidents that have occurred in the past. Historical accounts of UFO landings and contacts, such as this contact. Why not? Let's open this up. Let's have the Department of Defense Inspector General's office given access to this information. Let them go in front of a congressional committee or a Senate committee and report this. Let's talk about these things. They gave gun sight videos of the incidents happened at Nimitz, on the Nimitz, and Roosevelt.
Capture all objectives.
That's
Keep them secure.
recent. Let's talk about what happened
We're taking Alpha.
back in the 1950s. Let's talk about the incident of Bar 2. Let's talk about a confrontation that occurred between a military policeman and an extraterrestrial. So the military policeman fired his gun, but nothing happened. The bullet went through. Didn't seem to harm the extraterrestrial. But we don't know that. Why? Because ET's got in the craft. The F-102s, and later on, the Canadian Forces F-101s didn't catch up to this craft. If it was a Soviet transport craft, we could have overtaken it. In fact, it would still be on the ground because it would have ran out of fuel. So we would have had it on the ground. captivity the Soviet crew members. The Air Force report doesn't talk about the Soviet transport plane, or where it went, or how it was refueled, or how it took off. If it was there on the ground, it would have had to be fueled, because it would have had to come from a great distance to get there. There wasn't any Soviet transport plane. This incident involved an extraterrestrial craft that landed at this radar site. For some particular reason, we don't know why. Why did it only hit? Maybe it was drawn there by the signals being emitted by our radar. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe it was drawn there by frequencies. A radar operates on frequencies. Maybe that's what it is. Or maybe they were just curious. What Earth base creatures have down there? So they went down there and investigated themselves. And lo and behold, they get confronted by Earthlings, and one of them firing some kind of a weapon. We don't know anything other than what I just told you. But if we can get this document and get it unredacted to this disclosure that was supposed to happen, and at other locations around here. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on the incident at Bar 2. Until next time, this is Richard Cody. Thank you for watching.
So if you wanted to make one for your Instagram or whatever, just hit the plus button, add text or panel, add image, I'm gonna click it again. I'm gonna click the Instagram option, drag it full screen, done, and then I can go to my Instagram, which I just nuked and started from fresh, so if you guys want to support me, then you can find me over at CPause Music at Instagram. What it should look like. So I'm going to copy this URL, hit copy, and then I'm going to paste that URL in here, and then I'm not going to put a description because it's just going to be simple. You click on the Instagram, it's going to bring it up, so hit submit, give it a second. We're going to go wait for that to finish. There we go. And hit edit panels. Rules and Instagram, but you see if I hover over rules, nothing happens. If I hover over Instagram, there's a link that I can click. So I'm going to click it, and I'm going to bring up Instagram, and boom, there's my beautiful little face. Then if we click on edit, panels again, you'll see these things that are called extensions. So if you don't see this, and that's okay if you don't, we're going to go to the top right corner and then hit, where the heck is it? I think it's Creator's Dashboard. Yeah, Creator Dashboard. And then go to the left-hand side and click on Extensions, and then you'll see we got a bunch of extensions. So if you're not a Twitch affiliate and don't know what a Twitch affiliate is, then chances are you are not a Twitch affiliate. Then you can only use certain extensions. So if you're just starting off, you can obviously add your Instagram feed. So I'm going to click on my Instagram feed, or if you don't...
Enemy securing Bravo. Friendly mosquito active. Taking target. Secure 2 objectives. We're losing Alpha. Compromised. Get objective Charlie secure. Securing Bravo.
See it, just go into search all extensions. I'm just going to call it Instagram, and then you can put Instagram feed plus, Instagram feed. Literally just pick whichever one that you want. I'm going to pick this one because it was like recommended. Click on it, be like, okay, it'll show my Instagram feed. So cool. So I'm going to hit install, and then I'm going to follow the directions. Instagram username. So it's now updated my Instagram. I'm going to hit save, and then that's it. We're going to hit activate, add as a new panel, and then hit done. So we've added that below our stream, but let's add one more before we go back. We're going to go back to discovery, and then let's add one of the pages. So I'm going to hit the top right corner and go to Streamlabs, hit enter. I'm going to look for Streamlabs stream schedule. Click on that, and then I'm going to install it. I've already installed it, so I'm just going to uninstall it for you guys. Then hit install, and then we're going to have our own customized stream schedule and countdown, which is dope because it will automatically convert to the time zone that your viewer's watching at. So let's say we're streaming at Monday and Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central. So it's an army time, unfortunately. So just take whatever number and then add it by 12 if it's in PM. That's what I've been doing. So 7 plus 12 is 7 p.m. So the same thing over here. So it's going to be, what is it? What did I just say? 19 by 0. So that's 7 p.m., 7 p.m. And then my time zone is Chicago. And then I hit save settings. And I hit activate, add as a new channel. Now we can go back to the top right and channel. And then look at this. We got our little banner, offline screen. We go to chat. And then boom, we got our bio, title. We got our animated countdown schedule timer telling people live next time shown as Chicago, because I'm in Chicago. And then we have our Instagram feed, which people can interact with and all that stuff. Now we have our Instagram panel, which is kind of redundant now that we have that, so we'll probably get rid of that. Then we have our rules. So basically, you can just rinse and repeat with all this to design your Twitch channel and make it as smooth as possible. So you can drop a like if this video helped, and you can watch this video to the side of me to take your stream to the next level. My name's Cody, and I'll see you in the next video.
That was cool. Barely hanging on. Need some medical.
Enemy taking Alpha.
Hey, get back!
Taking Bravo. The enemy has captured 2 objectives. Get them secure. We're losing Alpha. Friendly cluster mine deployed. Hostile Guardian has been deployed.
And I'm very lucky to have Carl Nell here joining me for this conversation. Carl, thank you so much for coming. And Anthony and AJ over at Salt, thank you so much for hosting this. So Carl, maybe to begin, can you share a little bit about your background?
Flash out.
You are, and perhaps why people should care what you say.
Sure. Well, thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. It's a fantastic event, and I'm glad to see a large bunch of folks that stuck it out to the end for this talk. So I was fortunate. I had a 4-year ROTC scholarship to Penn. I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. The Army sent me overseas to do Signal Corps engineering projects, so I did a lot of strategic comm projects in Europe. I ended up working in Army Space Command. I commanded a satellite ground station, war trace to the Joint Chiefs. I spent some time at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The Army ultimately sent me to get a master's in mechanical engineering, a master's in strategic studies, graduate work in computer science. I was on track to stay in, but I decided that I wanted to pursue more of a technical career. So I got out and ended up working at Bell Labs, which was a fantastic place. Unfortunately, I was there during the trivestiture that folks may be familiar with, where the company got split up. I left Bell Labs and ended up working in Lockheed Missiles and Space. I worked at Northrop Grumman. I've ran strategic technology programs in the defense industry, worked for a lot of the three-letter agencies, ultimately was a deputy chief of staff, or deputy CTO for a $2 billion company. I was a vice president general manager of a Northern Virginia-based R&D firm. I stayed in the military, in the reserve. I commanded at every grade level through brigade. I was fortunate to stand up the Army's newest expeditionary MI brigade. I was the deputy chief of staff for a combatant command. Ultimately, this experience sort of combined to give me the opportunity to come in and advise Army Futures Command, the largest reorganization in the Army Reserve since really 1973, on how the Army could be more effective. And my last assignment was involved with the UAP task force, which maybe is the most apropos for this discussion.
And so, Carl, here's the million-dollar question. Do you believe that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet?
Right. So non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that.
And so, Carl, that is quite a bold statement. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, how confident are you that that is true?
There's zero doubt.
And Carl, what evidence have you seen? What was the moment where you developed this level of conviction? Because what you're saying is extremely consequential and very important, and I know that a lot of people here even perhaps may not believe that statement.
Right. Well, probably a better way to ask that is, how can the folks in the audience come to the, a common understanding of what this phenomenon is? And so there's sort of two tracks here. One is from first principles, and another is actually from the data. So let's take a look at the data. So we can look at some folks that have very high level access to information, like Paul Hellyer, who is the defense chief for Canada, has come out and said the same thing. We can look at Ham Eshed, the head of Israel's, or former head of Israel's Space Force, has said the same thing. Chris Mellon, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intel, SAPCO, has essentially said the same thing. Lou Elizondo has said the same thing. David Grush has said the same thing. David Grush cleared for presidentially level material. So you're looking at people that are in a position to know this, and they're telling you the same thing. You could take a look at the Gang of Eight in the Senate and in Congress. So there's two members of the Gang of Eight, Marco Rubio and Senator Chuck Schumer, that signed up to the UAP disclosure amendment last year that basically said they're not being told the truth and we need to push forward on that. So that's sort of an overview of some of the data. From a first principles standpoint, what's so unusual about this realization? There's billions of stars in the galaxy. Life here evolved in 500 million years, which is basically a blink of an eye. We've found planets around every star that we've looked at. It's likely that the universe is full of life. If you look at the SETI program in particular, the SETI program has all the same assumptions that you would accept and probably make with respect to this topic, except that they believe that non-human intelligence is transmitting signals here. But at the same time, like we're not.
Bullshit,
SETI doesn't transmit signals, and the only signals that are actually broadcast at high enough power into space for somebody to pick up come from broadcast television and ballistic missile early warning systems, which you could argue our technology is moving away from. We're going to satellite, we're going to fiber. Broadcast TV is a thing of the past. And if you get to some state where society is stable, maybe we don't need ballistic missile early warning system. So the other guy is probably not going to transmit. But what the other guy may do is come here if that's possible to do. And there's physics models that suggest that may be possible.
And Carl, I mean, what you're saying is extremely consequential, and you've referenced other people that have said the same thing that also have similar credibility. There's similar reasons for why we should believe many of these folks. Yet the government itself has not formally disclosed. They've been very reluctant to do that. Why? Why do you think that is?
So there's 6 basic reasons, and this, again, you could draw this out from first principles. There's a national security reason. There's the lack of a plan. There's the potential for societal disruption. There's the possibility that there's some non-public agreement. There's the potential for misdeeds and the desire to cover up misdeeds. And there's just the basic organizational intransigence and lack of priority that might be associated with the topic. So all these things are factors. The issue is that really the national security issue subsumes all the others. And so there's an opportunity maybe to contract the national security issue similarly to what was done with nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, such that nuclear energy is not necessarily classified and is available to the public. But lack of a plan and potential for societal disruption are key ingredients that would prevent any responsible leader from coming forward with information that they don't have the means to address in a responsible way. It would be irresponsible to do that.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you have absolute conviction that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet, that there are factions within our own government that know about this, yet we still don't have a plan, and they may represent a security issue. This may pose a threat to humans, yet you still believe that we should disclose. Is that right?
Correct, right. So there's really 3 reasons that trump all those others. And those others are basically valid, like I said. So the first issue is the moral right. The government exists for and by the people. And so the nature of reality is fundamentally not government information. People have a right to know the world in which we live, and the pursuit of happiness requires that knowledge. So that's sort of the first kind of overarching philosophical foundation of this. But, you know, as a corollary to that, if there are misdeeds that were done, then they need to be remediated. If there's lack of proper oversight, which is suggested by some of the whistleblowers, that needs to be remediated. So the first issue is the moral issue. The second issue is being in a reactive mode is never preferable to being in a proactive mode. So reactive mode is basically trying to prevent disclosure. But failing that, you might get a situation where you have catastrophic disclosure that creates all the problems that you were trying to prevent. So a more balanced middle path of controlled disclosure is the best way to do this, which is again an argument for some amount of disclosure. And the third part is simply societal advance and global competitiveness. More brain trust needs to be brought into this topic in order to make progress and to improve society. And so all 3 of those things together trump the 6 other reasons for non-disclosure.
And what do you think happens if we don't disclose? I know you mentioned this idea of catastrophic disclosure. Maybe disclosure may be forced upon us. How do you think about that?
So the situation is usually thought of as a binary state. It's like an all or nothing. And people have sort of argued this. But anybody paying attention realizes the government has already indicated that unidentified anomalous phenomena are real, they're not ours, and they're not our adversaries. The Pentagon has said that. Like, for people that are paying attention, like, that shoe already dropped. So for a lot of people, they think that the second shoe to drop is this is non-human intelligence, and you know, maybe the conversation stops there. Like, the president comes out and says, you know, there's non-human intelligence. The truth is that that will precipitate this crescendo of other questions that maybe the government's not ready to answer. That report does not precipitate potential negative ramifications for society. And so as an example of this, I would actually point to something from the ancient past, the Bronze Age collapse. So Eric Klein, Princeton University, 2015, wrote a very interesting book called 1177 BC, the year that civilization failed. And so this is well known to current scholarship. Within a single lifetime, all of the very effective ancient civilizations of the Bronze Age failed due to a confluence of reasons that are not necessarily fully understood today. So we're talking about Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Minoan Empire, the Manasseh Empire, the Babylonian Empire. All these civilizations failed, never to return, other than, let's say, Egypt. And so these were highly sophisticated civilizations with highly developed infrastructures, highly developed administrative states. They were globalist, in a sense, very similar to today. In terms of the known world, the known Near East, they were economically interdependent. They had both diplomatic ties and commerce ties. And yet these civilizations failed in a single lifetime because of stressors that these civilizations collectively could not address within the time frame. And so if we look at our society today, one might argue that it's similarly fractured, similarly under economic stress, similarly under cultural stress as well, fractured and fragile diplomatic situation. It mirrors very much this scenario.
Yeah.
And so for a responsible decision maker, that is certainly a factor.
And so I guess when you say that, are you implying that perhaps we as a society may not be ready for disclosure? Or are you saying that we may not be able to defend ourselves against this other force?
So there's sort of different viewpoints on, whether people are ready to, deal with this phenomenon. And, popular culture is kind of infused with this stuff. Roswell became a meme a long time ago. We got programs on ancient aliens, Skinwalker Ranch, all this stuff. I guess I would draw an analogy, though, for people believe in a certain faith tradition, whatever that faith tradition is, and hold to that, subscribe to that in a very serious and devout way, and sort of pose the question, even for folks of that ilk, and I would count myself as one, if you're confronted with the reality of your religious belief system, like the reality of metaphysical, an angel, a messenger from God, what have you, that's going to be a sea state change in your way of dealing with reality, right? Even though you already believe it, right? So it's one thing to believe and it's another to know. And I think in this context, this phenomena is the potential for an analogous effect both on the individual and on society.
Yeah, but do you think that the phenomenon, this non-human form of intelligence, represents a threat to humanity?
So this is a good question too. And some of the other folks have sort of framed things in that light. And I guess I would suggest that if the universe is governed by conservation laws, and it's probably reasonable to assume the laws of nature that we understand apply everywhere. We may have incomplete understanding, undoubtedly we do, of these laws, but they're sort of homogeneous and they apply throughout the universe. And so those laws are governed by conservation rules. There's conserved quantity. And so this reality really forces a Darwinian type competition in order to survive. And so it's reasonable to assume any other civilization that's evolved has come up through the same Darwinian evolutionary process. So I think it's naive to expect complete altruism until and unless you get to a state of post-scarcity, where you essentially have no physical needs that we're kind of encumbered with in this universe. And so in some sense, it's the economics of the future that are going to determine whether there's cooperation, competition, or some kind of symbiosis.
Yeah.
And
inform
the intention. But to assume either malintent or complete altruism, I think, is somewhat naive.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is it's impossible to know the true intentions of a higher intelligence. We may be competing for the same scarce resources. We may not be, right? We may be almost irrelevant to them, and they may be acting altruistically, although we cannot safely assume that. And so I guess I'm curious, if we continue down this disclosure path, do you believe that
I'm having a
disclosure is
bad game
inevitable?
and I'm number 1. 5?
So,
wow, I gotta tighten up.
Again, people that sort of look at this topic and study it, and there have been some good examinations on this from a historical standpoint, have realized that, like, we're not in really a new state. Like, this sort of disclosure emphasis has come and gone over time. And so this is not the first time we've arrived at this stage. I would suggest that maybe the peak of this current cycle happened last December with the Schumer amendment, and then it got rolled back and defeated in the House. And so it remains to be seen, you know, if the process is going to continue. One hopes and maybe draw a little bit of confidence that maybe this will come around is the colloquy that Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds had back in December. After their amendment got killed, they basically went on the Senate floor and articulated their rationale for the legislation. And I think Senator Schumer, to quote him, almost said it was a travesty that this did not pass. So this is, you know, a bipartisan colloquy on a topic that I guess most people would probably consider fringe, and yet these two senators felt the need to do that and to double down on their desire to see this through.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see maybe a reintroduction of some version of that this summer, with the goal of maybe putting it into the NDAA by the end of the year.
Do you think that it's imperative that the United States leads on the disclosure efforts?
So this is an interesting question too, because this is a global phenomenon and it's affecting other countries just like the United States. The reporting on this is clear over decades. Other countries have reported this stuff. And not only that, you know, the Vatican has come out and made statements that reference or tangentially reference this topic. So organized religion has to say on this topic as well. So it's really a whole of planet, whole of humanity problem. And so the U.S. has got its role to play, but these other countries have their role to play, and it would behoove us to recognize that you know, U.S. action could be preempted by another party, and it'd be probably more conducive to work collectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that I don't fully understand that I'd love to get your thoughts on, Carl, I mean, if we assume that a higher form of non-human intelligence has been visiting this planet, if we assume that some of the statements made by folks like Dave Grush are true, that we have craft materials, and if we assume that those craft that we may have exhibit characteristics that defy our current understanding of physics, it would seem that that technology would provide an incredible strategic advantage to whatever nation ends up reverse engineering it first. And so, to me, that would imply that there is a race happening to reverse engineer this, and that this topic would be a top priority. Do you agree with that?
So I think some of what you say is a reasonable conclusion to be drawn, and I've suggested something similar in past statements. The point here, though, is to go from a pre-disclosure to a post-disclosure world, maybe two stable states that are separated by an unstable middle ground. And so how you make that transition, again, you know, this speaks to the concern about this catastrophic disclosure. And this has come up in sort of arms regulation too. Mutually assured destruction, however much we don't like it, is sort of a stable kind of, you know, geostrategic regime. You know, the Reagan era defense shield idea is also a very stable scenario, but to go from one to the other is very unstable.
Yeah.
And so this topic sort of mirrors that.
Yeah, and I know you and I were talking earlier about this idea that in order to really understand the phenomenon, it's likely that we have to further our understanding of reality itself. And I guess I'm wondering, I can imagine a future where we acknowledge and we know that there is a higher form of non-human intelligence, yet we still don't truly understand the phenomenon. We still don't truly understand reality. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that we'll ever truly understand what's going on? Or if part of the game, part of the journey, part of life itself is operating in an environment where at least part of it is fundamentally unknowable to us?
So this is a totally philosophical, epistemological question, right? Really about the nature of knowledge itself, right? Like, how can we know what we know, and how can we be sure about what we know? I guess personally, I subscribe to the idea that there is an ultimate truth, and that humanity, being, you know, created in the image of a higher power, is endowed with the quality to pursue an understanding of that. And so our you know, part of our objective in this existence is to seek that out and try to understand that ultimate truth to a greater and greater degree. And this would be a component of that, obviously.
Well, Carl, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. I'm hopeful and optimistic that together maybe we can move the ball forward here and further our understanding of what is really going on, because I certainly agree with you. I think it is very consequential that we figure this out. So thank you again for coming. Thank you again to Salt for hosting us. And thank you all for listening.
My pleasure. Ah, just having the beats off. Oh my God. Man, I'm one of the greatest in the world.
What is up, my YouTube friends? Today I am going to show you an awesome free application that's going to allow you to do all kinds of amazing things with your camera, including remove your background really easily, no matter what application that you want that camera to be in, whether it's Zoom or OBS or Prism Live Studio or Polypop, StreamYard, even Nukes, wherever you want it to be.
Ah.
Okay, welcome back everyone. I first met our next speaker, Richard Dolan, at the National UFO Conference back in October of last year, and found Richard to be very charming and extremely knowledgeable in his subject. He holds a MA in history from the University of Rochester and Alfred University. He earned a certificate in history from Oxford University and was a Rhodes Scholar finalist. Prior to his interest in international diplomacy. And in 2000, he published a 500-page study.
Yeah, I unlocked my camo.
This is the first study of a two-part historical phenomena from 1941 to the present. Records of more than 50 military bases relating to innumerable violations of objects, demonstrating that the US military has taken the topic of UFOs very seriously indeed. Dr. Edwin was called Richard while Dr. Hal Putoff, director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, Richard has published numerous articles on the intelligence community for UFO magazine, and he helped to found Phenomena, a magazine dedicated to leading edge issues concerning and society, and for which he continues to serve as editor and regular contributor. So let us now hear how UFO secrecy has damaged American intellectual life in society. With Richard Dolan.
Thank you, Tracy. You don't need that. Because we started late. Sorry, it's got snuck. I do want to get started on this topic, but I just wanted to update you on a couple of things I'm doing. 4 years now that I've talked about and volume 2. I would give it that a year. I look back at the first book that I wrote. And was supposed to be I also want to mention part of it is in going through that history of the MUFON for 30 years. I didn't get to see the I didn't see got 1970. And I've gone through every single issue. Well, I don't want to be part of any organization. Conferences that I've attended. In the sense that MUFON is different. MUFON is the organization that for over 30, 35 years has promoted the concept of scientific ufology and has not stopped doing that. It's admirable, it's important, and I'm glad it's been done. But I'm not really a scientist, you know? So when I talk, I mean, I talk about history and I try to be detached and objective about it. But history is not a science. It is not. It's a craft. It has a discipline, but it's not science. And so the last time I was at MUFON, I felt obligated to talk about science. And I complained about the concept of peer review. Someone after the conference said, you know, you came very dangerously close to being anti-scientific. What I was anti-establishment science, actually. My point then was, hey, who are the peers going to be doing my review? Who are these people? Peer review is not immune from political considerations, you know. So here for this conference, I was asked to talk about it. I made a decision about a year ago that at any conference I speak, until my next book is
Again from the back. one of the greatest
along with all the other bad things.
Earl Craig in the world.
Um, it's
I
been-
lucky. I'm one of the greatest.
I don't just talk about. I don't want ever to say the same thing over and over again. But it's a similar theme.
I like to do that to him. Gotta do that to him
What never
sometimes.
fails to amaze me regarding this topic, by the way, is how marginalized UFO research is.
Oh, they so mad.
But no matter how you look at it, whether from the point of view of pop culture or from the halls of academia and science, this is a topic that don't get no respect. In
Unlock my platinum.
pop culture, I think UFOs are considered a myth in some form or another, typically. There are, of course, a few people who are in the know, let's say, and they have a different view of
I gotta
this.
switch up
But I
the class now. Cause I done unlocked platinum on there.
as well.
Go to something
I
else.
do want to talk a little bit about popular culture. I don't want to spend a lot of. Here we go. UFOs as myth. What is popular culture? This man here was a great thinker about 150 years ago named Jakob Burckhardt. People think, what is Jakob Burckhardt doing at a UFO convention? I'll tell you. Burckhardt was a very, very great, one of the greatest historians who ever lived. And he was a great philosophical thinker as well. And in the late 19th century, wrote a book, I have a copy of it, called Force and Freedom. And what he did was to do a kind of sociological study of what he considered to be the three main forces in society that make it go. He called them culture, religion, and the state. And what he did in this study was to kind of understand how they reacted with each other. Now, that was a great idea, but the problem is when you think of culture today.
Insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind.
Kamala wouldn't change a thing? Their weakness invited wars, welfare for illegals, while Americans struggle. Now Kamala wants higher taxes on top of higher prices. We can't afford 4 more years of Kamala.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Yeah, I think our culture is the ultimate competitive advantage. I think it's our biggest differentiator. If you think back the last few years, COVID happened. It really reduced the human interaction. And I think we're rebounding out of that. We adjusted, we went with that, that was fine.
Yeah.
But I think the world
Try
is
that.
adjusting back out of that.
Gotta
and
get that
is
unlocked platinum,
craving
so.
human interaction and is craving this personal experience with people. And so the fact that we've never changed that as the expectation, even when it was, you know, mostly DoorDash drivers or whoever coming into our store, our baristas continue to have these really personal experiences with whoever it is that they're encountering through the drive-thru window or at the pickup counter, and it is the
where is, I mean, should we even have an independent culture? I have wondered about this all the time. What I see is a culture that is not independent, but rather a something that, you know, we're bombarded with by a kind of all-pervasive media system, electronic media or print media that's, no matter what you encounter, 90% of what you encounter in the course of a day is owned by one of 5 corporations globally. And I don't see much independent culture anymore. So that the concepts that Burckhardt described didn't really apply. But when I talk about pop culture and we talk about UFOs, you have to recognize that to a large degree, what we consider to be popular culture is a set of concepts that are imposed from above. They're corporate imposed concepts. And it's not simply corporate, because when you go to the very top of the structure of power in our society, this is obviously the case at corporate and political powers and intelligence people and so on, frequently will work together. How radical is that? 30 years ago, that's a radical statement. Today, it's like, yeah, big deal. We all know this. So gone are the days of Burkhardt, gone are the days of a largely independent culture. And yet, within such a culture, UFOs exist.
Kill confirmed.
You know, how do they
Hostiles
exist?
and secure their tags.
I've been on the history of times now. Don't get me wrong. But I have like very we have a great reputation context, I want to describe the Peter Jennings UFO study. Oh, I want to show you this. It is possible. British.
Throwing set flash out.
Not one.
Here's what I want to say. Not all media are the same.
Got contact.
In the ramp up to the Peter Jennings special, a number of people wrote to me, and they said, and I said, here's what's going to happen. They're going to inflate the competition. And that's what happened. We all remember this. But within that, taking it back here, not all media are the same. Because there's no one society that we live in, right? You have, look at society in terms of, you take this room in the United States, let's say there's 100 people here, and all the wealth is $100. And if this were a one person has 40 of the dollars. 19 more share another 45. That's our country. That's most countries. So within that society, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, that's not my point, but in that room, there's a political system. Just like with elections, energize the bottom classes just enough so that they
Don't say I never gave you anything. Barely hanging on. Need some medical.
We don't talk about it.
Throwing some text. Throwing flash grenade.
There's management-oriented media, the top 10%, and then there's the rabble. NPR, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and so what I have in hey, they can do UFO. History Council, the grabbing media, frankly. Just look at the commercials. If they're doing a Burger King, sorry, if they're doing that. But I have argued, and I maintain that truly strictly management, culture, media, they are not going to give you reality UFOs. Culture requires ideological rigidity. said, right? The main thing about the Peter Jennings
The enemy is gaining ground.
but there was really, primarily, they like the heavy people, and we talked about, well, what if there's
Counter
life out
UAV is
there?
online. Friendly on station. Holds the lead. Clock's ticking.
Infantile, utterly manner. When we got serious things going on, no
Hostiles launched a cruise missile.
mass criminality. Such road. So,
Easy mark. Airdrop inbound. Trophy system out.
regarding scientific culture, the other, let's leave pop culture for a minute. More practical.
Guardian ready.
UFOs are essentially banished. I will never forget, this is before the world of academia, chatting with a teacher about the Kennedy assassination. Forget UFOs. The Kennedy assassination was awful.
Switching mags.
This professor was Kennedy assassination, arguing and we talked a little bit That's Kennedy. Have you met in a university? Well, last time we talked about this. Enough. It was nearly censured and ruined by it was a scandalized good war that one of the
Enemy KIA.
to study. So within this culture, and this is management culture, right? This is elite management culture, which is why ideological rigidity is so necessary. People, you've got to be part of the club. Hence the they're just all scared as hell. They want to break ranks. The last thing here is that the result of such social pressure
Throwing some pits.
I mean, I wrote this down.
Enemy Overwatch helo inbound.
I watched it. And here's what he said. They're talking about, oh, and Susan Clancy, the other one that was offered too. But they, I hope they hear me say this. I'd like to hear me say this. For Susan Clancy and Harvard, all of that false memory experience. And I love her explanation of the McMinnville photograph, Trent photograph from McMinnville, Oregon, 1950. She says, quote, well, that could have been somebody throwing a disc in the sky.
Getting hit hard.
Who was there on the show that showed this explanation was not. And later they discussed why John Stock then said, as Susan has suggested, just a hubcap thrown up and somebody takes pictures. Now at that point, Larry King got on his case and said, come on, that's a and Shostak then said, well, it doesn't look like a hubcap, but the point is that there's no point of reference. You don't know how far away that thing is. Be an aircraft. Okay, an aircraft. You need a couple of cameras, he said. There's all kinds of aircraft. There's something in the sky there. To say it's an alien craft, that's a big step. Okay, that's what he said. Now, but what would be the scientific approach to that? Well, Dr. Shostak, the scientific approach is to ask the right questions. The scientific approach is not to fixate on why it can't be an alien craft. The scientific approach would be to investigate what it could be, okay? To inquire. And by the way, that photograph was one of 3 photographs of the craft, and then there was a 4th photograph showing a trail after it left. So the point is that the banishment of UFO from the world of science and academia causes a lot of stupid things to be said by people with otherwise, very nice credentials. There's a friend of mine who is a retired professor over out in California at Occidental College, Scott Littleton, great guy. And his story is, typical of people in academia who have an interest in this. Scott's now in his 70s, and he had to wait till he retired until he wrote a book on this, because he didn't want to deal with the hassle of being within a university environment and having to be a UFO author. And this is how it is. But the thing is, unlike what academicians say and unlike what the scientists say, UFOs are not delusional. They're not nonsense. They are not here solely for the distracted ingestion by the masses. They're real. There are some things that we can say very confidently. There are some things that we can't say quite as confidently. What we can say with absolute confidence is that the UFO phenomenon has involved real technology, doing real things that are not supposed to be possible. And that's quite a lot right there. This technology, since at least World War II, has engaged in U.S. military forces and military forces of other nations on many occasions. It's involved safety violations. It's involved alarmed responses. It has elicited the concern of the highest-ranking individuals within the military in this nation. So whatever these objects are, they are a matter of national security. That we can say with absolute confidence. In particular, for a relatively brief period in American history, and I say the late 1970s up to enabled researchers to obtain I'm not saying FOIA died after 1982, but Ronald Reagan did push through an executive order in 1982. And as the previous presenter, Essen, so carefully pointed out, a Freedom of Information Act request for the U.S. communications with the Turkish.
One down. Ain't much of a finisher.
So the Freedom of Information, it's had its ups and downs, and this is down. However, during its up phase, not everything out of the government, but it was at least possible. And we all know the story. CIA, all the military agencies. We don't know anything about UFOs. Suddenly thousands of pages come out now, including a lot. And among these official release documents, there is not a single smoke.
Tossing Semtex.
There's not a
Flash out.
Stop firing.
Talking about unofficial documents or unacknowledged documents.
Semtex out. Throwing flash. Watch out.
these released FOIA documents provide a very
One down.
related to serious military encounters with UFOs. After reading the you start to wonder. I'm not going to belabor this issue.
Ah!
I've done this before. Most of you heard something like this before. You know what? There's always people who come to us and none of us even been in this 30 or 40 years. We have to remember that there are fundamental realities to this, and it's helpful to remind ourselves.
Friendly UAV online. Area marked. You're cleared hot. Precision airstrike inbound.
And so I want to go over just a couple of
Watch out, thermite. Tossing signals.
November 5th is Election Day.
And your vote does matter. Elections are closer than you think. Sometimes it comes down to just a few hundred votes.
You gotta go vote. Pinky promise me. Visit vote.org
For more info on how, when, and where you can vote.
the basic documents.
You're halfway to mission complete.
This one I consider to be from Kirtland Air Force, January 31st, 1949. It's directed to the U.S. Air Force. There was a flurry of UFO activity going on in New Mexico. The question here described yet another of these sightings, which have been seen by about 30. AFC, AFS, WP, 4th Army, local commanders perturbed of phenomena. All appear to be same object at different points in trajectory. All house investigation to location of impact point depending. By implication of phenomena?
Sergeant Nolan, back in service.
Then there's an FBI memo from the same period, in fact, the same day. Same day that the Kirtland memo was issued, we have an FBI special agent sending a memo to FBI. It states that the matter of UFOs was considered top secret by intelligence officers of both Takes enough. Then we have this. The 1950 confidential memorandum with this is a remarkable brief. So brief, I want to read each sentence kind of very carefully.
Friendly UAV online.
So you can hear it here. 6:30 July. Objects of rounding form have been atomic energy. Okay. Next.
Friendly UAV
These
online.
objects reportedly were above 15,000 feet. Air Force jets attempted interception. Results. Now listen to this. All units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, units,
much of a
Air
finish.
Force fighter
Changing
squadron,
back.
and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have been alerted. The Atomic Energy Commission investigation is continuing, and complete details will be forwarded.
Semtex out. Flash out.
This story.
Tit for tat, mate.
And whatever happened to the report was alluded to in the memo? The answer to that might be contained in the wording of the FBI memo I quoted you earlier that was sent to Hoover, which stated that the matter of UFOs was considered top secret. Top secret. And yet, we have to remember, Stanton Friedman's point of the thousands of UFO-related documents
Throwing flash.
that we have gotten due to only the smallest handful of were actually top secret. best efforts of freedom of research far removed from the domain, despite what people had hoped back in the day or the era of the late 70s. Freedom of information has not turned out to be a magic bullet. It's also fairly obvious that UFO secrecy involves now, pilot classifications themselves are classified. Who knows how far they go? James Bamford wrote the book Body of Secrets, a study of the national security. He writes, like an endless spiral, there are secret classification systems with reflect on that. What we do know is that Canadian government official, in fact in the 1950s, Wilbert Smith, wrote Canadian embassy staff in Washington and learned that the subject of UFOs was, quote, the most highly classified subject in the United States government. That's what Smith wrote. The last of the early memos I want to show you, this is it. I've got other things. But I want you to see this. This is from Robbins Air Force Base in Macon, Georgia. It's dated July 9th, 1951. This describes a 10-minute aerial UFO encounter that took place in the early afternoon. The pilot was a first lieutenant. He was flying an F-51 on a routine flight from Lawson Air Force Base in Columbus, Georgia. Not far from Augusta, Georgia, he encountered an object that he said was flat on top and bottom and appearing from a front view to have rounded edges and slightly beveled. That's a lot of detail. At one point, the object dived while in front of the pilot's view. And when it did that, he said it appeared, quote, completely round.
But that like button and that follow button on Twitch, you just saw what I just did. I just killed these guys. I'm just tired of killing them. I'm the one like,
the report says from front view,
won like 3 in a row, then lose one, win 3 in a row.
Observer noted
Won like
small
10, 12
spots on
games.
the object.
Crazy.
Object did not appear to be
See you later.
aluminum. Only one object was observed.